The one thing people most often cite about the 1970 October crisis probably never happened. The October crisis, of course, is when a Quebec nationalist terrorist group stages 2 political kidnappings, prompting the federal government to declare the War Measures Act to bring the terror group to heel. One of the lines most cited about the episode is that the Canadian Army rolled tanks into Montreal. "Troops, tanks roam Quebec streets during October crisis," reads the official CBC Archives headline about the episode. The U.S. podcast History Daily did an episode on the October crisis, and they mentioned a flood of tanks into Quebec.
Immediately, tanks, helicopters, and thousands of armed troops will flood Quebec.
But there are no photos of tanks in Montreal from this period. The best you're going to do is a communist website which shows a tank that it says is in Montreal. But it's actually a photo of a Canadian Centurion tank in West Germany in 1975. Canada maintained armored divisions in Germany for much of the Cold War. Besides, it wouldn't make sense to send tanks into Montreal in this context. A tank is for blowing up buildings, hardened positions, or other tanks. It's terrible at rooting out a terrorist insurgency. What Montrealers probably saw during that period were armored personnel carriers, which do make sense. These are basically armored cars with machine guns on top of them. Not something you typically see on Canadian roads, but if you're dealing with a cornered terrorist group, it does make sense to send around patrols in these things in case someone decides to shoot at them or set off a roadside bomb. But again, that's a far cry from a tank. Anyways, the point of this is, it's not the only thing about this period that has been misremembered. The usual proper way to remember the October crisis is to poo-poo it. To remember it as an instance of the government invoking the War Measures Act for the first time ever in peacetime, deploying the military, and rounding up hundreds of people without charges. An episode defined by government overreach and gross violations of civil liberties. But on this podcast, we're not going to be taking the standard boo the War Measures Act approach. We're going to be doing the opposite, because maybe, just maybe, marching the army into Montreal in the fall of 1970 was a fantastic idea. Welcome to Canada Did What? The show where we take the big Canadian political events you might think you remember and tell you the real stories you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper, and in this episode, you're going to be learning things about the October crisis that you've probably never heard before. And the standard black and white story of a power-hungry federal government crushing Quebec is going to get a lot more gray. Picture, if you will, Canadian civil society being regularly terrorized by a violent extremist group committed to the overthrow of the existing government. They don't just want Quebec independence. They want Quebec to be transformed into an autocratic communist ethno-state. Now picture that this extremist group has been at this for some time. It's in its 7th year of a deadly campaign of bombings and armed robberies. That's partially why the kidnappings happened. They wanted to secure the release of what they called political prisoners. But Canada doesn't have political prisoners, of course. They were referring to members in custody in connection with these prior acts of terrorism. So when all of this comes to a head in the fall of 1970, the Canadian authorities do not wring their hands about blowback or escalation, at least in public. They didn't equivocate about how the terrorists had a point, but were going about it all wrong. Rather, the story of the October crisis is one of a Canadian government putting the brakes on an escalating extremist movement and doing it rather well. Because the violence did stop. When it comes to the issue of Quebec separatism, a whole bunch has happened in the interim 5 decades. But since 1970, none of it has involved people getting maimed or killed. We're supposed to be skeptical of governments that suspend habeas corpus and start rounding up people without a warrant. And that's what happened during the October crisis. But any criticism of the government overreach in this period should keep in mind that Canada successfully faced down a nascent, violent extremist movement and crushed it so thoroughly we never had to worry about it again. And they did all of this without firing a shot. The October crisis is usually summed up with this one line.
Just watch me.
That's the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau, telling a reporter how far he would go to stop the FLQ and free the 2 hostages in their custody.
I think it's more important to get rid of those who are committing violence against the total society and those who are trying to run the government through a parallel power by establishing their authority by kidnapping and blackmail.
From our vantage point several decades later, it's very easy to say, well, I wouldn't have invoked the War Measures Act. That was basically the position of the reporters questioning Trudeau, that the kidnapping should have been treated as a law enforcement issue. Let the Quebec police find the hostages using their existing resources. One of the interviewers even suggests to Trudeau that the price of a democratic society is that terrorists kidnap public figures sometimes. Here he is directly telling the Prime Minister that people like you should be prepared to risk kidnapping on occasion.
And my choice is to live in a society that is free and democratic, which means that you don't have people with guns running around in it.
All right, then
one of the things I have to give up for that choice is the fact that people like you may be kidnapped.
But there's a whole bunch of information you have that Canadians in October 1970 did not have. Firstly, they didn't know just how big the FLQ conspiracy was and how far it could go. A 2006 TV miniseries about the October crisis, appropriately named October 1970, emphasized the amateurish nature of the FLQ, accurately depicting them as ragtag and inexperienced students. And authorities were initially prepared to treat it that way. When the FLQ first kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross on October 5, 1970, the first reaction of authorities was to send in hostage negotiators and call for calm. It was only when the FLQ also kidnapped Pierre Laporte, Quebec's deputy premier, 5 days later that officials began reacting as if the kidnappings could continue indefinitely if they weren't stopped with overwhelming force. Second, the federal government in 1970 didn't know if this was going to spiral into full-blown insurrection. That sounds really dumb nowadays. Obviously, Quebec isn't going to descend into full-scale insurrection against the federal government. But that kind of thing had been happening a lot in the late 1960s. You've probably heard about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, 30 years of internecine conflict in Northern Ireland that basically became the worst-case scenario of the October crisis. That had all kicked off exactly 2 years prior in the wake of a suppressed civil rights march in Derry. Or take France, a fellow French-speaking nation. Just 2 years prior to the October crisis, they'd seen civil insurrection so bad that the economy completely ground to a halt, and French President Charles de Gaulle was forced into temporary exile in Germany. Here's a hit by the Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot.
Black day in July, Motor City madness has touched the countryside.
It's called Black Day in July, and thanks to CanCon rules, you've probably heard it several thousand times. It's about the 1967 Detroit riots, which saw 43 people killed and the destruction of whole swaths of the city. And I need not remind you that Detroit lies on the Canadian border. You could smell the smoke and hear the gunshots from Windsor, Ontario. So Canadian leaders in the fall of 1970 knew there was an awful lot of pent-up political resentment in Quebec. They also knew there was an active terrorist group utterly running wild through Montreal. And now you've got high-level figures being snatched from the street by terrorists threatening to kill them. And, we're going to get into this later, you have it being celebrated and excused by mainstream voices in Quebec. In October 1970, Quebec had just gone through the Quiet Revolution. Right before the onset of the 1960s, Quebec was a deeply conservative place where the Catholic Church was basically everywhere. At schools and hospitals, and at any parade or civic event, you would likely have a couple priests or nuns on the reviewing stand. By the end of the 1960s, you basically have the Quebec we know today. Fiercely secular, huge welfare state, folk singers, acrobats in heavy makeup, a network of hydroelectric dams that is the envy of the world, deconsecrated churches being turned into nightclubs, a metro system that is the pinnacle of mid-century modern design. The dark side to this cultural awakening was the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec. During the October crisis, as they held 2 innocent men hostage, one of the FLQ's demands was that their manifesto be printed and read out in Quebec media. They had other demands, including $500,000 in cash, about $4 million in today's money, the release of 23 FLQ political prisoners, and their safe passage to Cuba or Algeria, 2 countries where they felt a kinship with anti-imperialist revolutionaries. The manifesto is not an inclusive document, shall we say. It's anti-immigrant, framing them as invaders beholden to Anglo interests. It's anti-democratic. It declares that elections are rigged by a plutocratic elite, and the only way forward is violence. It also refers to Pierre Trudeau as a faggot, and throws another homophobic slur, twink, at Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa. Homosexuals apparently being one of several groups who wouldn't be welcome in FLQ-ruled Quebec. The manifesto also claims that the FLQ was, quote, not an aggressive movement, unquote. As we all know, is an eminently credible claim when you hear it read on the radio as a condition of them agreeing not to murder 2 hostages. James Cross was one of the 2 men held hostage by the FLQ during the October crisis, and during his captivity he made a point of trying to understand their belief system. He asked questions and even asked to be provided with the literature that inspired them, which he read. In a debrief with British authorities, Cross said that their aim was an independent socialist Quebec which is brought about by violence. And the violence part was important. Cross said that the FLQ saw Quebecers as a race of people who had been psychologically warped by centuries of colonial oppression, and that the only cure was a period of cleansing, violent revenge. We spoke with author Darcy Jenish, the author of The Making of the October Crisis, Canada's long nightmare of terrorism at the hands of the FLQ. As the title suggests, the book is about how the FLQ isn't just a bunch of overexuberant students, like they're often depicted.
The group that kidnapped James Cross, they were called the Liberation Cell, because what they were trying to liberate was these 16 guys, Felkistes, who were in jail. A lot of them were in jail for a long time. One guy had gotten 120 life sentences. Another guy had gotten a life sentence for murder. So there were 16 of these guys in jail. Their objective was to liberate them and have them sent to Cuba or Algeria. Now, Pierre Vallières, who wrote that book, Negre Blanc d'Amérique, White Niggers of America, his goal was complete revolution, overthrow the capitalist system. There was... The FLQ was not in any way, shape, or form a coherent organization with any well-defined goals.
It's difficult to overstate the scale of terror and chaos that the FLQ brought to Quebec during this period. There have really been few things in Canada quite like it. But the late 1960s, you have members of the Montreal police who can spend their entire shift rushing from one FLQ bombing to another. Here's how New Year's Eve 1968 played out for Robert Cote, a member of the Montreal Police Bomb Squad, which put him at the forefront of fighting the FLQ during this period. He was supposed to be at home with his wife, who had just miscarried twin daughters, but instead, at 11 p.m., he's called out to Montreal City Hall to investigate a bomb that had just gone off. He's en route with sirens blaring when he's told, actually, don't bother with the exploded bomb. There's an unexploded bomb on the other side of City Hall you have to defuse. And then, right after snipping the wires on the City Hall bomb, Cote has to speed west where a third bomb has just exploded outside a federal building.
The bombing started in April and May of 1963. That's when the first bombings took place. And the mailbox bombings were the most famous part of the whole thing, which was basically on the Thursday night and Friday night leading into the Victoria Day weekend in 1963. So, and initially they started attacking these symbols of federalism, federal institutions, whether it was the Montreal Post Office or Revenue Canada. But the bombings escalated as time went on in terms of the size of the bombs and the powerfulness of these bombs. So the very first bombs that these guys were making, like in April or May 1963, you would have maybe a couple pounds of dynamite in. And the mailbox bombs of the, what they call it, Black Friday in the Victoria Day weekend of 1963, those bombs had like 1.5 pounds of dynamite in them, like 3 sticks of dynamite. When you get into the heaviest period of bombings was in 1968-69. And I think there was 49 bombings in the city of Montreal in the space of 18 months. And some of those bombs were absolutely huge. I mean, the fellow that was my source into the story was Robert Cote, who was head of the Montreal bomb squad in the 1960s. So he was dismantling bombs. He dismantled this one bomb. It was in 2 duffel bags. It was 40 pounds of dynamite in each one. Would have blown him sky high if it had exploded. The biggest bomb was in July 1970. It was like 3 months before the October crisis. The bomb was concealed in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, was parked in a tunnel beneath the head office of the Bank of Montreal, and it had like 150 pounds of dynamite in it. I mean, it was just blowing everything up. So these bombs, they got very, very dangerous as time went on. And they were not the light little, firecracker type things that had implanted in a mailbox.
The FLQ didn't limit their enemy to Ottawa or Anglophones or even the Quebec government. It was anyone who didn't submit to their very specific conception of an independent communist Quebec. The FLQ targeted refineries. They targeted media outlets who criticized them or who simply broadcast in English. They targeted railroad tracks. They targeted factories. They tried to kill not one, but 2 prime ministers. John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson were both targeted by FLQ bombs on visits to Quebec. Often, when an FLQ bomb went off in the Montreal area, it was sometimes hard to figure out why they had planted it. They particularly loved blowing up statues. Remember in the summer of 2022 when mobs incensed by purported discoveries of unmarked Indian residential school graves began pulling down historical statues across Canada? Not a lot of those statue desecrations happened in Quebec, in part because the FLQ and its sympathizers had already done it in the 1960s. A statue of James Wolfe in Quebec City was pushed over and destroyed in 1963. That same year, Quebec City's Queen Victoria statue was beheaded with dynamite. The most prominent Quebec statue destroyed in 2022 was a Montreal monument to Sir John A. Macdonald. The FLQ had planned to blow up the statue in 1963, but pulled back due to the risk of killing bystanders, a compunction that would soon desert them. Because they did kill people, often working-class Quebecers that they claimed to represent. The first was 65-year-old Wilfred O'Neill, a veteran of both World Wars who was killed instantly by an FLQ bomb left in a back alley. The bomb had reportedly been earmarked for the MacDonald statue. Thérèse Morin, a 63-year-old secretary at a shoe factory, had her body shattered beyond recognition by a bomb concealed in a shoebox and left at her side by a teenaged FLQ operative pretending to be a delivery boy. Jean d'Arc Saint-Germain was 51, a civil servant killed by an FLQ bomb planted at National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa. In 1964, FLQ robbers walked into a Montreal gun store, murdered manager Leslie McWilliams in cold blood, and in the botched robbery that followed, another gun store employee, Alfred Piniche, was accidentally killed by police. The guilt-stricken officer who killed Piniche, meanwhile, would later take his own life. Walter Liha was another Second World War veteran who had landed in Normandy shortly after D-Day and had fought all the way to Canada's liberation of the Netherlands. In 1963, while still with the Royal Engineers, Liha was sent to defuse a series of mailbox bombs laid by the FLQ in the predominantly English-speaking neighborhood of Westmount. After successfully defusing 2, an infamous series of press photos capture what happened with the third. The bomb explodes in Liha's face, and when the smoke clears, there is only his twisted, near unrecognizable body. Liha lived for another 29 years, But he never left the hospital. He had lost both hands, large portions of his face and chest, and suffered severe brain damage and partial paralysis.
I mean, a lot of terrorism doesn't make any sense to anybody outside those who are planning or carrying out terrorist acts. A lot of the FLQ violence didn't make sense to anybody, even all these years later. You sit there and try to figure out what were they trying to do. So there was no clearly defined goals.
Which all brings us to the events that kicked off the October crisis itself. British diplomat James Cross was at his home in Montreal when two men entered under the guise of delivering a package. The package was a concealed automatic rifle. They pointed at Cross and tell him that if he doesn't do what he's told, he's dead. And then they pointed at his wife and tell her that if she doesn't stop their Dalmatian from barking, they'll kill it. Then they jam a rubber gas mask over his head with the eyes painted over and manhandle him out the door. Cross was a UK civil servant. He had nothing to do with Quebec politics. He wasn't allowed to have anything to do with Quebec politics. They picked him because he was an easy target, and because he was, in their words, an Anglo-Saxon. A representative of the, quote, ancient racist and colonialist British system, unquote. And for that, his kidnappers said they wouldn't have the slightest qualms about liquidating him, as they called it.
But Who's Who was a thing published annually, like Who's Who in Canada. You could go by city, and you can see who the prominent people were, what their occupations were, where their addresses were, if you can imagine that. And they had the address of the American Consul General, and they had James Cross. They were living in the same area. And the night before the kidnapping, it was like, which one of these two guys should we kidnap? And they kidnapped James Cross because he had a fairly regular habit of going for a walk before work. And so they could scout out his house. But they also saw, well, he's a bit of he could be seen as a symbol of British, oppression, colonialism.
Cross was a Second World War veteran who, somewhat ironically, had participated in liberating another Francophone jurisdiction, France, from an actual fascist oppressor. Cross would maintain an ice-cold bearing throughout this whole ordeal. When the kidnappers told him he'd be murdered if their demands weren't met, his immediate response was, "In that case, I must compose myself for death." Cross, who died of COVID-19 at the age of 99 in 2021, very seldom spoke about his FLQ captivity. But in a rare oral history Cross recorded in 1998, he said he was never scared of death, but would prefer if he weren't strangled. "I didn't seem to mind being shot," he said. Pierre Laporte, meanwhile, was kidnapped from his front yard. Laporte and his brother had married sisters, and both families lived together on the same block. That's why kidnappers had caught the deputy premier when he was throwing a football with his nephew on the front lawn over the Thanksgiving weekend. Suddenly, a car pulled up and men armed with sawed-off shotguns forced him into the vehicle. That nephew was the last member of Laporte's family to see him alive. The Chevrolet that sped away his uncle, meanwhile, was the same car in which Laporte's battered body would later be discovered by police. The FLQ had picked Laporte because he was easy to kidnap. His name and address were in the phone book, and when the FLQ called his home to ask if he was there, his wife replied that he was in the front yard. As with Cross, it didn't really make sense for him to be a target of radical left-wing nationalists. Remember the Quiet Revolution I mentioned? Laporte was a figure in that. During the ultra-conservative period preceding the Quiet Revolution, the so-called Grande Noirceur, or Great Darkness, Laporte had been an investigative journalist who was among one of the few prominent voices to critique the political corruption of the period. He then became a member of the Quebec Liberal government, whose upset election in 1960 would kickstart the reforms that defined the Quiet Revolution. At a time when the FLQ was first learning to make bombs, Laporte was helping to lead reforms that, among other things, allowed French Canadians to assume managerial positions in crown corporations and the civil service, and to serve in those roles while speaking French. Up until 1960, the language of business and administration in Quebec was English. But for a group like the FLQ, whose goal was to turn Quebec into a Cuban-style communist dictatorship, anything short of guillotining the Anglophone big bosses, or at least forcing them into exile, was simply playing into their hands.
Pierre Laporte, I mean, it was pure convenience. I mean, the Laporte kidnappers was a haphazard, sloppy job. I mean, completely. The cross kidnappers were organized. They planned this thing weeks in advance. The Laporte kidnapping was just totally haphazard. These guys came, Paul and Jacques Rose and Francis Simard, they'd been on a trip to the States, raising money through fraudulent means. And they were down in Texas when they heard about this kidnapping of James Cross. They raced back to Canada, get in the night before, and they started planning a kidnapping. And what they did was, I think they just looked in the phone book and they saw, Pierre Laporte's name. He lives, they were in Saint-Hubert. They had this house in Saint-Hubert, which is on the South Shore, and a South Shore suburb. And Laporte was in the neighboring suburb.
And the part of the October crisis that is most often overlooked is also the part that most horrified the decision makers who had to live through it. Quebec universities loved the FLQ, and they particularly loved an FLQ that was kidnapping people and threatening to kill them. Soon after the kidnappings, students at the Université de Québec, the Université de Montreal, and several cégeps walked out in a bid to pressure authorities to cave to the FLQ's demands. Whole faculty departments endorsed the FLQ manifesto. A pro-FLQ rally at a Montreal hockey arena drew between 1,500 and 3,000 attendees. Pro-FLQ journalist Pierre Valliere was a featured speaker, and he told the ecstatic crowds that their role now was to, quote, organize the fight for liberation in each district, in each plant, in each office, everywhere. Still in captivity, James Cross saw all of this on TV. He remembered later, it did seem at that point as if a very large number of people in Montreal were supporting the aims and objectives of the FLQ.
There was about 4,000 or 5,000 students packed in there. It was actually a rally there was a mayoral campaign going on in Montreal at the same time. And anyways, one of the municipal parties there had rented this arena, was holding a rally that night, and Pierre Vallières and Chartrand and Levesque and this other fellow, they hijacked this meeting and took it over. And they gave these rabble-rousing speeches, and these kids were all fist-pumping and saying FLQ, FLQ, chanting. And then when they left the arena that night, the plan was to hit the streets tomorrow with massive demonstrations. So it very well would have spiraled out of control. I mean, it's hard to sort of make a case for something when you prevent something from happening. But what the government prevented from happening was massive street demonstrations. And when you're talking about a police force that was overextended already, because so many officers were working day and night trying to find these hostages.
5 days after Laporte was kidnapped from his front lawn, Canadian soldiers were deployed into Montreal to serve as auxiliaries under the command of police. A day after that, Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, suspending habeas corpus and granting police powers to pretty much arrest whomever they wanted.
The soldiers were there as an extension of the Montreal police, the civil authorities. They were actually under the control of the Director General of the SQ, the Sécurité du Québec, and the Sûreté du Québec. So the soldiers were there to guard public buildings, to patrol the streets, and really they were under the control of civil authorities, not the military authorities. And it was really to relieve the Montreal Police Department, which was badly overstretched during this crisis.
You'd be forgiven for thinking that the decision to invoke the War Measures Act and deputize the military to assist the police was the unilateral decision of Pierre Trudeau. But it had been called for by both Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau and the newly elected Premier Robert Bourassa. At the time, Bourassa defended the measure by noting that the FLQ had started out with violent demonstrations, then escalated to bombs, and then escalated again to kidnappings. Said Bourassa, logically, the fourth stage would be selected assassinations.
People were just so shocked by these kidnappings and then the murder of Pierre Laporte that there was very broad support in the Canadian public for the invocation of the proclamation of the War Measures Act. It's only in, I think, in the aftermath and, people who've looked back at this, writing about it, the debate was whether or not Pierre Trudeau should have proclaimed the War Measures Act. And a lot of people have said, clearly we're offended by the arbitrary arrest and detention of people. I mean, under the War Measures Act, there was 495 Quebec citizens arrested and detained, and most of them were never charged with criminal offenses. So that put off some people. But at the time, it was very, very popular. Amongst the public and within the House of Commons, there was a vote heavily in favor of the use of it.
The military historian Desmond Morton has written that, given what we know now, the use of the War Measures Act in October 1970 was, in his words, unjustified. But, Morton added, it was a brilliant success. Desmond Morton was not a right-wing reactionary. In fact, he was a lifelong campaigner for left-wing causes. But Morton knew the Canadian military. He knew academia, and he knew the state of radical politics in 1970 Quebec. At the time of the October crisis, Morton was serving as an official historian at Department of National Defence headquarters in Ottawa. I'm going to read this whole quote from Morton, which he published in his 1985 book, A Military History of Canada. Shock was the best safeguard against bloodshed. Trudeau's target was not two frightened little bands of terrorists, one of which soon strangled its helpless victim. It was the affluent dilettantes of revolutionary violence cheering on the anonymous heroes of the FLQ. The proclamation of the War Measures Act and the thousands of grim troops pouring into Montreal froze the cheers, dispersed the coffee table revolutionaries, and left them frightened and isolated while the police rounded up suspects whose offense, if any, was dreaming of blood in the streets. The members of the FLQ did not receive justice. They murdered innocent people and attempted to spark an armed insurrection against the legitimate government. That's textbook treason. It's still in the criminal code. You're not allowed to, quote, use force or violence for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Canada or a province, unquote. But the strange duality of the October crisis is that it features one of the most hardline crackdowns in modern Canadian history. And then in the aftermath, the people who warranted this all-out crackdown were basically given a slap on the wrist. The October crisis ended when the FLQ released James Cross in exchange for their core members being allowed passage to Cuba. But within 15 years, all of them had returned to Canada and been paroled after sentences of only a few years. Paul Rose was the likely murderer of Laporte and remained wholly unrepentant of his crimes. He was free by 1982 and remained so until his death in 2013. But one upside to this is that there were no FLQ martyrs. The defining figure of the Quebec separatist movement wouldn't be a bomb-throwing radical. It would be a chain-smoking former CBC reporter who abhorred violence. René Lévesque had served as a U.S. Army liaison officer during the liberation of Western Europe, and said he had been among the first Allied soldiers to see Dachau concentration camp. And he'd worked alongside Pierre Laporte in the Quebec Liberal government. After Lévesque left the Liberals and founded the separatist Parti Québécois in 1968, he failed to win more than a handful of seats in the 1970 provincial election. Lévesque said that the election results were a step backwards, engineered by the, quote, financially powerful, unquote. Lévesque was then horrified to find that statement used a few months later by the FLQ. It was placed right in their manifesto's opening paragraphs.
The mass revulsion on the part of Quebecers towards this sort of thing just had to suggest to anybody that this sort of violence was a complete dead end. But at the same time, you had the Parti Québécois that gave a legitimate, outlet for all this discontent. René Lévesque had formed the party, walked out on the Liberal Party in 1968, formed the Parti Québécois. But obviously, as you get into the 70s, people's energies are now devoted towards electoral politics. They see the Quebec, the Parti Québécois as a legitimate vehicle for their aspirations, and that kind of takes all that energy that might have been channeled into violence or terrorism, takes it, diverts it to, peaceful, democratic means. And of course, Quebecers themselves were horrified by these kidnappings, especially by the murder of Pierre Laporte. He was a popular cabinet minister. He was, a well-known figure in Quebec, and that just shocked the populace, and I think that just brought everything to a halt.
Lévesque would famously refer to the FLQ kidnappers as sewer rats. To him, Quebec independence was always going to succeed or fail democratically. It was never something that was worth killing for. When his Parti Québécois veered into extremism, such as after a 1981 convention that called for a unilateral declaration of independence and applauded one of the FLQ kidnappers, Lévesque set it straight by threatening to resign. In fact, here is Lévesque in 1972, right at the beginning of his journey as a separatist politician, calmly saying that if Quebecers can't figure out independence by the 1980s, it probably won't happen.
I understand that our English-speaking fellow citizens in Quebec will never agree. They'll just have to take it or lump it when it comes, but it won't come from them, that's for sure. So if the French Quebec side can't make up its mind before the 80s, I think then I don't know, but it'll be too late for that kind of development in the political sense.
There's been a lot of revisionism. I mean, in Quebec, people like René Lévesque, Jacques Parizeau, Camille Laurent, all of these PQ luminaries in the aftermath of the FLQ, and as well as people, historians and journalists, have taken up a totally different slant on the whole events. They would say that, Pierre Trudeau brought in the War Measures Act to try to crush our movement, which was absolutely insane. I mean, Trudeau had no fear of the PQ, Parti Québécois, at all. The use of the Canadian soldiers is called the invasion of Quebec. I mean, as if using Canadian soldiers on Canadian soil is an invasion. So there's been within the Quebec historical, community, journalism, there's been a lot of, revisions of this story.
Accounts of the October crisis often gloss over the circumstances of Pierre Laporte's death, possibly because it's so disturbing. If James Cross was the ice-cold British diplomat prepared to meet his fate with a stiff upper lip, Pierre Laporte reacted to confinement the way he'd usually reacted to iniquity, with non-compliant hostility. By the kidnapper's own account, Laporte tried to escape by jumping from a window, becoming tangled in his manacles in the attempt and becoming cut on the broken glass. Rather than take him to a hospital, they strangled him. Some accounts say it was with his leg chains, others that Laporte was suffocated with a religious chain he wore around his neck. The decision to invoke the War Measures Act had always been a gamble. For the month that the Canadian Armed Forces were deployed in Quebec, not a single civilian was wounded or killed. The only casualty of the entire operation was a soldier on guard duty who tripped over his rifle and fatally shot himself. If that hadn't been the case, if you'd seen, say, soldiers firing into an aggressive pro-FLQ crowd, the October crisis would have had a far different outcome. Particularly when you consider that the soldiers deployed into Quebec in 1970 were mostly Anglophones. But any revulsion Quebecers felt about seeing soldiers in their streets was quickly trumped by the revulsion at the group of young men who had murdered their deputy premier. Press photographers were on scene at the moment that police opened the trunk containing Laporte, and newspapers the next day showed the politician's bloodied corpse shoved against a filthy spare tire. The FLQ had gloated in their murder of Laporte by saying that they had executed the province's, quote, Minister of Unemployment and Assimilation, unquote. In 2020, Pierre Laporte's son, Jean, who was 11 when he lost his father, gave a series of interviews to mark the 50th anniversary of the October crisis. He did not express any strong opinions on the invocation of the War Measures Act or the notion that a more accommodating federal government might have freed his father. But the younger Laporte does hold the view that the moment his father died is also when Quebec's appetite for violence died with it. If you're looking for who killed Canada's most violent domestic terrorist group, it wasn't the War Measures Act, it wasn't Pierre Trudeau, it wasn't Robert Bourassa, and it wasn't René Lévesque. As Laporte told La Presse, the FLQ killed the FLQ. Canada Did What? Is a post-media podcast. This episode was hosted and written by me, Tristan Hopper, and produced by Andre Proulx, with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libben is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Canada Did What on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you pay us enough, I'll even send it to you via cassette tape. If you like this episode and want to hear more of Canada Did What, you can help make that happen by simply leaving us a rating or a review and telling everyone you know to listen as well. Thank you for listening.